Welcome to the J.D. Levy and Associates Calibration Point podcast. Our podcasts are designed to bring a conversational exploration of key topics that we believe will provide value and insight to those serving in the nonprofit sector. We will highlight new developments in the field, latest research, and things we're learning from our own clients that we can share.
I want to welcome everybody to this month's episode of the Calibration Point podcast. I'm super excited to have a longtime friend with me today, Bob Jones. Bob has just a dearth of experience throughout his career as the CEO, executive of a large national company, philanthropist, foundation work, board relationships, board chair, board membership, leader in so many civic causes. Bob just brings a dearth of expertise and experience in different places around the country. And Bob and I were having a conversation and didn't know it was going to turn into a podcast at the time. And he was sharing with me just some things that he learned when he was board chair of an organization that went into bankruptcy. And we thought, wow, that would be a great topic that Bob could come on the show and share for all of our listeners to just explore and pull some things out, Bob, that you thought would be really helpful to anybody who's serving, especially on a board. And you were board chair of this organization at the time, which gives you a whole nother level of insight. So, Bob, thank you, one, for your friendship all these years. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm super excited about it.
Jamie, always good to be with you. Thank you for all you do for the nonprofit world. It makes a difference. And it's just an honor and a privilege to be with you today.
Thank you. So, Bob, I just want you to just kind of unpack with us. Tell us about this experience of this bankruptcy, and then let's pick out some learnings from it.
Yeah, I think let me just start by, we often jump on nonprofit boards and don't always have our eyes open, our ears open. And this may be a case of that for me. I was approached by my boss to join a board of a arts organization.
Okay.
I joined the board and, eventually worked my way up to an officer level. And as with many arts organizations, we struggled. But I think, Jamie, the I hate to say the word nail in the coffin was we received a fairly large bequeath.
Okay.
And this was prior to me joining the board. And rather than put it into an endowment or put it into savings, we got the brilliant idea to take our product to an out-of-market location and use our product, which our main driver was a holiday-themed performance. And so holidays, December, we decided to go out of market in July and perform this holiday-themed artistic form. And it was an unmitigated disaster. So in the unmitigated disaster is we were in a market, nobody knew who we were. We were spending money that we probably should have been saving. We were taking a performance that is tied to the holidays and trying to get people in July to come visit it. And I think the lesson you learn there is know what your mission is, know what your strategy is, and don't be so anxious to spend money. Realize that having a little cash in the bank, a little bit of endowment makes a lot of sense. So quite frankly, the organization never really recovered. From that day forward, we were hand to mouth. We'd beg, borrow, and steal. We formed partnerships with other arts organizations. And lo and behold, some 3+ years later, we ended up having to declare bankruptcy and shut the organization down.
Wow. So let's kind of go back and explore a few of these items. So there was a large bequeath that came in that sounds like was not donor restricted and didn't have donor intent assigned to it.
We could have done whatever we want to do with it. I mean, think about it. You get a bequeath that doesn't say go out and perform in an out of state market doing something. This generous person wanted to do what was right for the organization. And I just think we lost sight of who we were and what we were. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us is remember who you are as an organization. And while it's great to dream, but make sure the dreams have substance.
Substance. Yeah, that's such a good point. And, coming from a former corporate CEO who expanded a lot of territories in the banking industry, I mean, you get that, calculated risk is really important.
Absolutely. And, I think, in the other lesson that as I look back on it, as with a lot of boards, excuse me, as with a lot of boards, we had some very strong voices on the board. And these strong voices carried the day versus people that probably looked at this strategy and said, what in the heck are we thinking of doing? But because the strong voices were pounding on the table, and many of them were large donors. So as you know, in the nonprofit world, when you're a large donor and a strong voice, you sometimes get more than your share of the podium. And I think that's exactly what happened here.
Let's unpack that a little bit. That's a really good point, and it is. I mean, it is I would say most people in our audience have experienced that, right? Where they're the lone board member, or like, in your case, you were the board chair. That was the minority in the voice, or coming into that situation, and people don't feel heard, or we have undue influence by a couple of leaders, especially donors. I would just add, so let's look backwards now over your career. I mean, you are a significant philanthropist. You were a CEO of a large company. You're a well-respected, significant community leader. And you're in a lot of situations, and have been in your career, where there were a lot of dominant voices probably pushing your leaders or you in areas that you knew were not where you need to be going. Like, what advice would you give to the executive director who's listening to this right now and saying, yeah, I'm totally hearing you, because that's where I'm at right now, and I don't know how I can change the power balance. Do you have any advice on what you
just
used?
Always remember what your mission is. And even in my job, we had a mission, and every time we would make a significant decision for the organization, we would look at the mission and say, does it fit within the mission? Our mission was serving communities and doing what's right. And then I think with that mission, you also have an ethical compass. It's very important. And,
right.
So many times we get that ethical compass pushed by people that want to pound on the table, that have bigger voices. But if you can wake, my grandma used to always tell me, Jim, if I can lay my head on the pillow at the end of the night and I did good, then I'm still okay. And sometimes you've got to stand up to those loud voices. Yeah. And, with all due respect, if people like that don't agree with the mission, don't agree with that ethical compass, they're probably not best to have on your board. And yeah, it might be painful, but that's a short-term pain and a far long-term benefit. And, so many times we get, and it's a good example of short-termism too, because we were focused on this, we're going to go make a lot of money out of market. Very short-term. You got to keep that long-term focus. And, when I was in the business world, I was so blessed to have a board that always took a long view. And we live quarter to quarter. We're a publicly traded company. But my board always said, take the long view. If you have a couple tough quarters, it's okay, as long as we know where we're headed, back to the mission, and we do it in the most ethical way.
That's a really great perspective. We can have a couple tough quarters if we know where we're headed.
Yep.
Yeah, such important advice and especially in the nonprofit world, where it's so easy to think that we can cash flow donor revenues based on our monetary cycles as opposed to their giving cycles.
Yeah.
Which then, begs another question about, okay, are they thinking about cash reserves and endowment building, which I know is something you really champion. How would that have changed this situation, do you think?
Well, we'd probably still be in business, quite frankly. You take this large bequeath, and you put it into an endowment, and you go out and say, we've just got X amount. Would you be willing to continue to good funders, good philanthropists want to see an organization and build an endowment or some reserves. Right. It's easier to, it's the old adage, it's easier to raise money when you have money. And, the fact of the matter, Jamie, if we had done it right and had built the endowment versus spending, we'd probably still be in existence today.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So number two, the opportunity cost of money, right? I mean, they had an endowment, or could have had an endowment, which was the cost. And instead they decided that maybe there's a way we can market a new product. And to your point, take a performance out of our market and test it, and gambled a whole lot. It sounds like, obviously, in that experiment.
Yeah. It just, it's easy to go, hindsight's always 2020. They'll go back and say, it's a holiday performance in July in a market that doesn't know who you are. What the hell were you thinking? But, we got convinced that, this was going to be our way to grow ourselves. And it's great to focus on growth, but again, I go back to the longer view and staying to the mission. It can't be growth at growth's sake, right? As a
Right.
former, one of my roles was as a lender, and
Hmm.
hyper growth companies aren't always the best because you got to have that foundational element, and this company just did not have the foundational element.
Yeah. And we see that in the nonprofit space now with a lot of these high cause, I will call them focused, raise quick cash and lift the organization fast in what are more venture philanthropy models. And to your point, they become high growth, but they're not sustainable because they're not thinking through, okay, what do we actually need to be here in 10 years?
Yeah, back to the mission, right? And what do
Yep.
we need? What's that long-term view? And sometimes in a hyper growth market, you tend to forget relationships because you can get
Mhm.
very transactional. We're going to get that next dollar. We're going to get that next dollar. Well, you forget, the original donors who have been your loyalists, but you've moved on to the next shiny penny, which is a little bit what we were doing, chasing that shiny penny in a different market. And you lose those, again, long-term relationships by always chasing that new penny.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So let's talk about the board, the rest of your board that you had. Where were they? I mean, obviously there were some dominant voices that were championing this. Where was there a focus at all? Like, so after this started to go south, talk to me about how did the rest of the board start to react to that? When did the writing become clear? How did they start to react? I know you shared with me what was really fascinating, and that was when you turned in the final papers to come to actually dissolve the organization in that experience. Let's talk about where they were when it became clear we were going south.
Yeah, you quickly realize who your friends are when you have a board that's on a nonprofit that is struggling. I'd say at
Mm.
that stage, Jamie, we had half the board that just became disengaged or left
Wow.
because they could see that, it wasn't going to be successful. We had a quarter of the board that was busting their tail to try to do whatever they could to make it successful, and a quarter that were supportive, but yet nervous. And, it was a situation that as hard as we tried and hard as we tried that just you couldn't dig out of the hole we had. And again, an expensive art form. And, at the end of the day, we had to make the right decision, which was, as a fiduciary, what's the right decision you have? And for us, unfortunately, it was to shut the organization down and declare bankruptcy. We didn't have a lot of debt, but, we had some assets we had to protect. And, we ended up selling those to another similar organization. But, the side comment is, to this day, I remember the board meeting, we made the decision to close, turn it down. And the only no vote we got at that meeting was from the artistic director of the organization, which is completely understandable.
Yep.
But the next day we said the board will come in, we'll notify the associates and let them know what we're doing. And I show up at 8:00, ate the prescriptive time, and I was it.
Wow. So no one else.
It's a tough situation, right? So you make that tough decision and you face the consequences of it.
So talk to me about, so one, to your point, which I like your comment, when a nonprofit organization is struggling, you learn who your friends are. And that's a really good point at the board. Like, who's really in to try to be the hero of the story in a sense.
Yeah. Jamie, I'm sorry I cut you off there, but it just comes such a point. It reinforces the need to have an annual evaluation of your board and an annual recommitment to your board. The most successful boards I've been on is when you sign a statement that says, here's my expectations as a board member. And, it includes, philanthropic support, it turns time support, understanding the mission. Sometimes you get on boards where it's just per functionary. You show up, you go to the meeting, you sit on it. But I strongly believe that every board needs to have like an annual review of, do we have the right people? Are the people committed? And then you have to have some tough conversations saying, maybe Fred, it's not the best place for you. If,
Right.
And then, I always try to reinforce that in the first meeting of the year, saying, okay, well, here's where we are. And then you need to, reinforce. And, there's subtle things you do, which is reinforcing the strategy and the mission in the beginning. But one of the tricks I think I learned from you is we do mission moments now. Many boards is
Yeah.
just you get people that are impacted by the nonprofit you're serving to reinforce why we're doing what we're doing.
Why
So
are we here? Yeah, absolutely. And at that point, that calibration can't just happen once a year.
yeah,
It has to be continuous and dynamic, as you
yeah.
know.
Sometimes you have tough conversations saying, I appreciate you taking up a chair, but we don't need bodies. We need effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take this another step. How can you talk to us, whatever you can share? How did the communication to the donors go?
Yeah, interesting. That's such a great question. I would say anger from half.
Mm,
Like, why couldn't you do more?
right?
Well, yeah, there's only so. And then relief, and I would say relief is the best word.
Wow.
People that have been strong donors for years have finally said, you made the decision for us because we were getting to the point where we were afraid too. And, it just reinforces the need to have good communication with your donors, being open and honest. But yeah, that it was an interesting conversation.
So, did you have any donors that had made large commitments that had prepaid that want?
No,
How did okay.
yeah,
So, you were good on that. Okay.
yeah. And part of it is those folks we started talking to early on when we knew that
Okay.
that things were going to be challenged and that we had these challenges. So, you know, we had a staff of a few, but we did some good communication.
Okay, good. Then when they made the decision to take their theater production to a different market, to your point, that didn't fully logically make sense in that process. Were there donors that raised concerns at that point?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
But again, you had strong voices that on the other side of the table that, again, it's back to what we started with. Sometimes you got to have tough conversations with strong voices, and sometimes you got to tell them, take your toy and go home. You can't play with this anymore.
Right. That's right.
And, that's hard to do. But again, mission focus. What are we here for? So,
Yeah. What are we here for? And mission focus, vision focus, and then the value, the ethos of morals of the organization.
absolutely.
And then I also heard you talk really critically about making sure there's continuous board evaluation that's happening and that we're raising the bar for who ought to be a leader. And it's okay not to be on the board.
Yeah. Sometimes, and the other part, we talked about it tangentially is just great communication to the board and to the staff. And, it's a mentor once told me, if you think you've communicated enough, do it again, do it again, do it again. You can't over communicate, particularly in tough cities. It's easy to highlight the home runs. It's not so easy to highlight the strikeouts and the bad problems.
That's so true. And in the nonprofit space, when we don't highlight the home runs, but everybody else highlights the strikeouts for us.
Absolutely. Yep.
Which, yeah, right, becomes even more challenging. So we don't celebrate our success, but then everybody points out the weakness and the failure.
It's a funny world, isn't it? And yeah.
It absolutely is. And so good communication. And it sounds like, at least on the positive note, the thing that was happening early on was that there was donor engagement and donor messaging that was happening. And that's very positive.
Yeah. Jimmy, because we were still trying to raise money up until a few months before to sign.
Gotcha.
We did all we could do to try to save this thing. And it just, at some stage, you got to make that very difficult decision.
Right. So then last question on this is, a lot of people, so we get this asked a lot because they have to think about it when they set up their organization. That's dissolution. We start a nonprofit organization with the end in mind. In your case, so most organizations where they struggle is thinking about, okay, if we have assets, who are we going to gift those to? In your case, you had assets which you liquidated, and then I'm assuming you had to then basically give those assets to another organization. How did you decide where the assets were going to go?
Yeah. Actually, to use a corporate world, we were bought out of bankruptcy. We had a similar arts organization that bought all of our sets and scenery and costumes. And We were able to use those funds to pay off whatever debt we had at the stage or outstanding obligations. So we are a volunteer attorney, a fellow board member that did a great job of finding a like organization that paid us X that helped us alleviate some of the financial pain that we had caused in the marketplace with payables, et cetera. So,
wow. And that's the point to understand for everybody who may go through this is obligations don't just cease because you file bankruptcy, they change.
They change.
Right.
And again, back to planning is, when you always plan to be grossly successful, every board needs to think about what's our alternative plan. If things don't work, what do we do? And those are not as much fun conversations as planning the next gala.
Right. That's such a great point. Understand how we plan the defaults, what happens if, and make sure we know what the ifs are. And there's a lot of research, and we do this with clients as well. But to that point, I use kind of the analogy that I'm not a golfer. I don't play golf well at all. And when my friends want me to go with them, I always kind of laugh because they don't know what they'd be getting into. But it's kind of like taking a board that doesn't play golf, and then all of a sudden the fire sale happens or the fire happens, and we're asking them, right, all this, they got to be experts. And so, and I know I'm sure you did this in your corporate life, but we really encourage our clients a lot to role play and just scenario play out with their board, take times throughout the year.
So important, Jamie. And the other part of it is when you are in either super crisis or potential crisis, we get fixated. I've been on boards that their only fixation is we're going to cut cost.
Better way to success.
I always say, you can't cut your way to prosperity, and
that's right.
You can die by 1,000 paper cuts, but don't limit yourself and broaden your thinking. And whether it's other revenue opportunities, it's partnerships, it's alignment with others, consolidation, mergers. Don't get fixated. I've been on boards, and every board meeting for 5 years is how we're going to cut costs. And we finally just say, you know what, we got to find other ways to fix this thing. And but it takes time. It's kind of it's like turning a cruise ship into harbor. It takes time.
Right. And a lot of times you have to have a tugboat to help.
Yeah, exactly right. And sometimes more than one.
That's right. And we forget that in the sector. And to your point earlier about the board, and I taking it back to why are we here? If we lose sight of that, it's easy to get myopic on and I'll use that quote, we'll just cut our way to prosperity, and that typically doesn't happen.
Yeah. I've never seen it happen in 40 some years in the business world. That's
a great point. That's excellent.
Jamie, you've got to go back to mission. You can't address your mission cutting costs.
Right. We have to be able to resource and not starve the organization.
Yeah.
Bob, I so appreciate your time. This has been great. And just kind of the recap with that last piece, we don't cut our way to prosperity, and we have to kind of put a bow on that and take it right back to what you opened us with. Be clear on the mission, be clear on the vision and our values, and then make sure in between those bookends that we're building a leadership culture that's going to have that uncanny focus to drive that. Yeah, that's great. So appreciate your time. Really enjoyed this. And thanks again for being with us.
Thanks for all you do, my friend.
Thanks for listening to the J.D. Levy & Associates Calibration Point podcast. If you have comments or ideas for future episodes, please reach out using the contact page on our website, jdlevyassociates.com.